A thick veil of Arctic fog smothered the Barents Sea. Steel-gray waters churned under the weight of Soviet naval might. Cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and submarines formed the backbone of the USSR's premier surface strike group. The scenario, a full-scale war exercise simulating Western encroachment on the northern frontier. Soviet flags whipped in the wind. Engines roared. Sonar arrays pinged methodically. But 200 feet below, in absolute silence, something watched. USS Providence, a Los Angeles-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, had slipped undetected beneath the fleet 2 days earlier. Every maneuver, every sonar sweep, every radio call was recorded in its fire control system. Its passive sonar arrays mapped the entire Soviet task force without emitting a single detectable ping. It stalked from beneath, a steel predator tracing prey oblivious to its presence. At precisely 04:13 hours, torpedo tubes 1 and 3 hissed. Simulated Mark 48 torpedoes streaked upward. In the exercise control room aboard the Soviet flagship, alarms blared too late. Virtual detonations lit up command logs. One cruiser, destroyed. A submarine, sunk. A destroyer, gone. All in the first minute, but radar showed nothing. No enemy aircraft, no ships on the horizon. No active sonar hits, just digital indicators flashing, target lost again and again. On the bridge, the Soviet Commodore froze. His fleet, designed to fight NATO battle groups head-to-head, was being slaughtered by a ghost. No missiles, no fighter jets, no naval artillery, just something deep, silent, and unseen. Radio operators scrambled. Anti-submarine teams dropped sonar buoys. Helicopters launched. But the invisible assailant had already slipped away. The exercise was terminated within 18 minutes. Post-action reports showed the entire Soviet strike group had been virtually destroyed, 14 ships killed, without ever detecting the attacker. The weapon was not just the submarine. It was the doctrine it represented: passive tracking, networked command, silent strike, and total acoustic control for Soviet Naval Command. It was not a drill. It was a revelation. They had built their fleets for the last war. But the next one would begin and end without a sound. For decades. The Soviet Navy followed a singular belief strength in visibility. Their fleets, bristling with missiles, torpedoes, and radar arrays, were designed to dominate any opponent they could see. Battleship doctrine had evolved into missile cruiser doctrine, an overwhelming barrage of guided firepower meant to annihilate NATO carrier groups in open combat. Their pride lay in the numbers. Over 270 submarines, dozens of guided missile cruisers and destroyers. Aircraft carriers were in development, and anti-submarine warfare was being aggressively upgraded with new sonar platforms, Ka-27 Helix helicopters, and the formidable Udaloy-class destroyers. But the doctrine behind this power had a fatal flaw. Soviet command assumed submarine warfare was a knife fight in the dark, loud, short-ranged, and mutual. The prevailing belief was that any U.S. submarine would eventually reveal itself by active sonar pings, torpedo launches, or evasive maneuvers. Soviet planners wagered that their sensor grids, air patrols, and hunter-killer groups could react quickly enough. But the Los Angeles class made that entire theory obsolete. When the USS Providence infiltrated the Soviet exercise, it operated in a completely different paradigm. It didn't emit. It didn't maneuver aggressively. It simply observed, calculated, and struck all in total silence. The Soviets never even got to the reaction stage. That was the true horror. Soviet sonar operators had been trained on older, noisier submarine profiles. They expected hull reverberations, propulsion noise, and cavitation signatures. But the Los Angeles class used pump jet propulsors, isolated machinery compartments, and anechoic tile coatings that absorbed sonar signals rather than reflecting them. It was invisible, not just on radar, but in the acoustic spectrum the Soviets had relied on for detection. In post-exercise briefings, the Soviet admirals grilled their technical staff. Was this a fluke? Was their sonar calibration faulty? Had NATO somehow cheated? None of the answers reassured them. A KGB liaison present at the debrief recorded a chilling quote from a Northern Fleet vice admiral. "If this is how they fight now, we will lose the next war before we even hear it start." The revelation shattered a foundational belief. Soviet strategy had assumed that war would be fought by mass ships, mass missiles, mass formations, but mass made them visible, predictable, and worst of all, trackable. Meanwhile, the Americans had invested not in mass, but in silence, speed, and first-strike precision. And in that silence, Soviet naval doctrine cracked wide open. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union's naval doctrine operated under a strategic fantasy that in any future war, it could bring overwhelming firepower to bear before NATO could respond. The vision was cinematic missile cruisers firing P-700 Granite missiles in synchronized salvos, submarine flotillas closing in on carrier strike groups, and a tidal wave of kinetic destruction overwhelming American defenses. But this doctrine had one fatal timing flaw. It assumed that the first to detect the enemy would be the first to strike. That reaction time, not stealth, was the deciding factor. The Soviet Union had built its naval forces around eyes-forward detection. Massive mast-mounted radars on Slava and Kirov-class ships were designed to scan the sea for threats miles away. Helicopters and fixed-wing maritime patrol aircraft filled in the gaps. Their submarines often ran active sonar, preferring to risk detection rather than sail blind. But by the time the Los Angeles-class submarines entered the deep game, the Americans had thrown out the entire Soviet assumption. Their approach was built around one truth: if you're detected, you've already lost. The U.S. Navy's Submarine Force Blue didn't just field quieter boats, it trained for asymmetric engagements. They ran drills not just to evade detection, but to paralyze enemy fleets with a single strike. They didn't fear being outnumbered. They counted on it because the bigger the fleet, the more noise it made. Soviet commanders couldn't see it coming. When the USS Providence sank half the Soviet fleet in a war game before they could fire a single simulated shot, it wasn't the firepower that shocked Soviet brass. It was the precision, the knowledge, the preparation. The submarine hadn't just fired at random. It had tracked each ship for days, choosing the order of kills based on strategic disruption. Destroy the communications ship first, then the ASW cruiser, then the flagship, in just 3 minutes. Soviet command and control was vaporized in simulation. And worst of all, not a single Soviet vessel had a contact bearing on the attacker. This was the final rupture in their naval doctrine. It didn't matter how many missiles they had, or how many ships, or how brave their crews were. If you couldn't find the enemy, you couldn't fight. In Moscow, these failures ignited closed-door debates. Doctrinal committees argued over changes, but their hardware lagged years behind. Even when they tried to design a counter, the Akula class, they still couldn't match American sonar stealth. The doctrine was broken, and the future belonged to those who could disappear first and fire second. On a bitterly cold January morning in 1987, the Soviet Northern Fleet launched its most complex naval exercise in years, Operation Polar Wave. The scenario was meant to simulate a NATO carrier group approaching the Barents Sea. Surface combatants, submarines, and naval aviation would coordinate to detect, track, and destroy a theoretical American incursion. What they didn't know was that the USS Dallas, a Los Angeles-class submarine, was already inside the area uninvited and undetected. Dallas had slipped through the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, using a noise profile so low it practically merged with the ocean floor. From the moment it entered Soviet-controlled waters, it never once activated active sonar. Instead, it used a complex array of towed sensors, fiber optic arrays, and passive signal triangulation to locate the Soviet fleet before the first missile simulation even began. The impossible happened on day 2 of the exercise. At 04:45, Soviet command aboard the Admiral Nakimov received alerts simulated hits had destroyed 2 of their lead cruisers. Seconds later, 3 sonar buoys strategically placed weeks in advance by a Soviet reconnaissance ship reported nothing, no propeller signatures, no sound anomalies, no signs of hostile activity. Yet in the simulation logs, the American submarine had killed 5 warships, disabled another, and evaded counterattack all before the Soviet radar net even picked up a target. The most experienced Soviet sonar operators thought it was an error. One commander famously asked, "How can you strike what we can't hear?" But it wasn't a glitch. The Dallas had used a tactic so counterintuitive it broke Soviet logic. It had positioned itself beneath the acoustic shadow of a Soviet destroyer, exploiting the noisy cavitation wake of the older ship to mask its own approach. Then, using upward-launching torpedo simulations, it killed the ship above it and moved on without leaving a trace. To the Soviets, this was black magic. A submarine traveling inside the acoustic curtain of their own ship, undetectable, and deadly. No doctrine, no system, no war game had prepared them for that. Their sensors were blind, their radars were late, and their command response times, so meticulously drilled for carrier battles, were now rendered irrelevant by something they couldn't see, hear, or fight. The event caused an uproar in the Kremlin's Naval Directorate. Internal memos demanded investigation. Was there a leak, a mole, a failure in the Soviet ocean surveillance system? But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. It wasn't sabotage. It was just better strategy, better stealth, better silence. The impossible had happened, and the Americans had done it without even firing a real shot. When the after-action reports of Operation Polar Wave reached naval headquarters in Moscow, disbelief turned to fury. The Soviet General Staff, already suspicious of the exercise's premature failures, demanded an immediate internal review. According to their doctrine, this kind of kill ratio 1 American sub simulating the destruction of nearly a dozen warships wasn't just improbable, it was insulting. Admiral Chernovin, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, reviewed the logs in disbelief. No sonar detections, no radar contacts, not even a periscope wake. The exercise had been stacked in their favor, complete radio discipline. Forward deployed ASW anti-submarine warfare helicopters, full coverage of hydroacoustic buoys, and yet somehow, one Los Angeles-class submarine had evaded it all. The internal term floated by the Politburo's Defense Council was provokatsia, provocation. Perhaps the Americans had been tipped off. Perhaps NATO had somehow accessed Soviet exercise plans. Perhaps the entire attack simulation had been manipulated. But those weren't the most disturbing possibilities. The haunting realization grew quietly. Perhaps the Americans really could do this. Soviet defense engineers were summoned to analyze the USS Dallas's acoustic profile based solely on open-source intelligence and fragments from previous NATO encounters. Their estimates concluded that the Los Angeles class wasn't just stealthy. It was categorically invisible in certain conditions. When moving at low speeds and hugging thermal layers, its acoustic signature dropped below the detection threshold of most existing Soviet sonar systems. Worse still, classified intercepts from Soviet electronic monitoring posts indicated increased U.S. undersea activity in both the Pacific and Atlantic during similar Soviet exercises. What if the Dallas event wasn't an outlier? What if it was doctrine within the halls of the KGB's Technical Intelligence Directorate? One colonel allegedly whispered to his superior, "If they can hear us from that far, they don't need a warhead to win, just a microphone." The disbelief shifted into something deeper, systemic fear. Project Titan Moscow's long-gestating plan to build a new class of nuclear attack submarines was abruptly reprioritized. Resources were redirected. New low-frequency sonar programs were ordered, and the Ministry of Defense quietly increased funding for passive sonar upgrades. But none of it could undo the embarrassment of Operation Polar Wave. In an internal memo later leaked by a disillusioned naval analyst, A line stood out like a warning to the entire Soviet hierarchy. One American submarine demonstrated that our fleets are not defenders of the homeland, but steel coffins waiting to be discovered. The message was clear: the silence the Soviets once relied on had turned against them. They hadn't seen the attack coming. They hadn't even seen the attacker. And now, the Kremlin was beginning to understand the battlefield beneath the sea belonged to someone else. In the cold logic of Soviet naval doctrine, quantity had always been a shield. More ships, more sensors, more noise. These weren't just assets. They were deterrents. The prevailing belief was simple: if you flooded the sea with enough steel and sonar, no enemy could operate unnoticed. This was the doctrine of density, and it was dead wrong. After the simulated destruction of their entire exercise fleet, Soviet strategists huddled in war rooms, attempting to piece together how their formation, bristling with anti-submarine defenses, could have been eviscerated by a single opponent. The working theory. The Americans must have exploited a sonar blind spot caused by overlapping acoustic signatures from tightly packed Soviet vessels. They called it maskirovka obrabotka, signal masking by overprocessing. In theory, the dense formation had generated so much internal sonar clutter that it created pockets of acoustic invisibility. The Soviet analysts believed the USS Dallas simply drifted into one of these zones and remained still cold, quiet, and deadly. But this was more rationalization than revelation. In truth, the Los Angeles class had done no such thing. Its attack run had been active, not passive. It had maneuvered aggressively. It had flanked the Soviet destroyer screen, penetrated the cordon, and simulated strike packages on every high-value target, all while never once appearing on a single Soviet sonar screen. Still, the Soviet command clung to their density doctrine. They doubled down, not just on ship numbers, but on multi-ship formations, more hulls, more sensors, more redundancy. The belief, if they couldn't stop a Los Angeles-class sub with one ring of steel, perhaps they needed two. By the time the updated Baltic Fleet Exercise Manual was issued 6 months later, its primary directive had ballooned into a grotesque overcorrection: triple-layered sonar pickets, overlapping depth charges, and constant rotor patrols. The American response laughter. NATO naval intelligence quickly intercepted these updates and sent them to Sublant U.S. Submarine Force Atlantic. The conclusion was immediate: the Soviets hadn't learned the right lesson. Instead of decentralizing and dispersing their fleet for survivability, they were concentrating it further, amplifying their vulnerability. A Los Angeles-class submarine didn't need acoustic cover. It created its own with silence. One American officer wrote in a confidential training brief, "They think we're hiding inside the noise. We're not. We're the silence they forgot to expect." But in Moscow, the theory persisted. They weren't ready to let go of the comfort that numbers had once provided. Mass had won the Great Patriotic War. Why wouldn't it win at sea? Because this was no longer about tanks and trenches. This was about shadows, speed, and silence. And the Soviet theory was not just wrong, it was suicidal. When the shock of losing an entire fleet in simulation gave way to analysis, Soviet naval intelligence turned to its next best guess: the Americans must have exploited a passive sonar gap. The theory was elegant, reassuring, and wrong. Soviet doctrine prized active sonar sweeps, pinging the depths with sound waves to expose enemy positions. But by the 1980s, this method was under pressure. Active sonar alerted everyone, including the target, to your presence. Worse, in wartime, it could paint Soviet ships as beacons for NATO missiles. So, in pursuit of stealth, Soviet naval strategy had begun leaning toward passive sonar arrays, listening instead of shouting. After the exercise embarrassment, Soviet analysts crafted a narrative the USS Dallas had known the precise frequency bands their hydrophones were listening to. It had manipulated its noise signature, sliding below the detection threshold, hiding in the ambient hum of the ocean floor. They called it the quiet curtain, a narrow band of sound just above the thermal layer where deep ocean currents created a low-frequency wall. The Soviets believed the sub had hugged this curtain, letting the temperature gradient absorb its mechanical noise and rendering it invisible. Again, it sounded plausible. Again, it was wrong. The truth was far worse. The USS Dallas hadn't hidden in any quiet curtain. It had hunted. Its advanced ANBQQ-5 sonar suite had passively tracked the Soviet fleet's every move, analyzing blade counts, engine harmonics, and rudder cavitation patterns. It didn't need to ping. It already knew everything. While the Soviets strained their ears for silence, the Americans built an acoustic fingerprint database so advanced it could recognize individual ships like human voices. By the time Soviet crews even suspected they were being watched, every detail of their formation had already been mapped. One after-action analyst from the Office of Naval Intelligence put it bluntly: the Soviets weren't outmaneuvered. They were outlistened. And yet, the Soviet Navy doubled down again. They invested in next-generation passive sonar arrays, dragging huge hydrophone nets behind their subs. But the Americans had already leapt forward. Their subs were becoming not just quiet, but predictive. Los Angeles-class subs used oceanographic models to estimate where sound would bend, where it would fade, where it would reflect. They didn't hide in shadows, they calculated where the shadows would be. And arrived there first. Soviet Naval Command, trapped in reactive thinking, was always behind the curve. The second wrong theory, like the first, was comforting. But it misread the battlefield. The Americans didn't cheat sonar physics. They mastered them. And with every new exercise, the Soviets weren't catching up. They were being catalogued. The year was 1985, and deep inside a concrete blockhouse near Severomorsk, a Soviet intelligence briefing was falling apart. For years, the KGB's GRU naval analysts had insisted that the Los Angeles-class submarines posed no singular threat advanced. Yes, but not game-changing. Their estimates placed the quieting capabilities of these American attack subs somewhere between the Soviet Victor III and Akula prototypes. Dangerous, but manageable. Then came the exercise in the Barents Sea. A single Los Angeles-class submarine, believed to be the USS Dallas or her sister Boston, had slipped under the simulated fleet of cruisers, destroyers, and anti-submarine helicopters. Within hours, the Soviet side had lost every key ship in the war game scenario. Sonar had never picked it up. Helicopters had dropped dozens of sonar buoys, all in the wrong ocean layer. Torpedoes launched at ghost contacts vanished into blue silence. What stunned commanders most wasn't that a submarine had attacked. It was that one boat, just one, could annihilate an entire battle group and escape untouched. The implications shattered Soviet assumptions. Their intelligence files, years in the making, were obsolete overnight. Declassified CIA records years later confirmed why. By the late 1970s, the U.S. had begun Operation Holy Stone deep penetration submarine surveillance missions that gathered not just acoustic profiles of Soviet ships, but direct mappings of ocean thermoclines, bottom topography, and harbor traffic rhythms. One particularly bold Holy Stone mission had taken place just off Petropavlovsk, where a Sturgeon-class sub sat on the seabed listening to outgoing Soviet boomers for over 36 hours. The U.S. Navy had effectively built a living atlas of the Soviet Navy's acoustic world. In contrast, Soviet sonar doctrine was built on rigid formulas and assumptions, designed to counter NATO patterns from a decade earlier. Even worse, the Soviet Navy didn't realize American submarines were using non-acoustic detection, magnetic anomaly detection MAD, sea current drift sensors, and even water salinity variations to track movement. The intelligence gap wasn't in hardware alone. It was in thinking. Where Soviet analysis favored centralized bulk data assessments, the U.S. Navy pushed tactical discretion downward. Sub-commanders like those on the Dallas were trained to adapt in real time, using both doctrine and gut instinct empowered by satellite relays and live sonar analytics from support ships hundreds of miles away. The KGB's internal post-mortem was ruthless. Their report, filed under Naval Signal Interference and Hostile Acoustic Superiority Class. Red Level concluded. Enemy capabilities have eclipsed known parameters. Immediate reform required. Full parity unreachable under current doctrine. It was the closest the Soviet Union came to admitting it had been completely outclassed in underwater warfare. Behind closed doors, the head of Soviet Northern Fleet intelligence reportedly muttered, "We thought we were watching them." But they had already written the script. The intelligence failure was total not because the Soviets had no data, but because they had the wrong questions. In war, answers can only be as good as the assumptions behind them. And by 1985, every assumption the Soviet Navy had made about American submarine warfare was a decade out of date. In the war rooms of the Pentagon, the true power of the Los Angeles-class submarine was never just the hull, the torpedoes, or the speed. It was the system, the integration of stealth, information, and speed of decision that made it the most lethal undersea predator in history. While Soviet admirals clung to sheer mass, more boats, more missiles, more sonar pulses, the Americans focused on the quality of the kill. At the heart of this transformation was the holy trinity of U.S. undersea dominance, acoustic stealth, data fusion, and network targeting. First came silence. The Los Angeles class introduced an evolutionary leap in quieting. The sound dampening wasn't just about rubber mounts or hull coatings, it was an entire shift in propulsion philosophy. By switching to skewed seven-blade propellers and isolating machinery on vibration-dampening platforms, the subs effectively erased their signature hum. In the ocean, where sonar bounces off every ridge and thermocline, this mattered more than speed or armor, but silence meant nothing without ears. Each Los Angeles-class boat was a floating data sponge. Passive sonar arrays like the BQQ-5 picked up faint engine signatures, propeller harmonics, and even the turbulence of enemy periscopes. These inputs were fed into advanced onboard computers, early neural net-style processors that could isolate and classify threats in real time. And if the sub's own sensors weren't enough, help came from above. From 1982 onward, the Navy began pairing subs with overhead satellite surveillance and SOSUS lines, massive underwater hydrophone networks strung across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. These systems could detect Soviet submarine movement from thousands of miles away and cue in the Los Angeles-class boats for interception, even before Soviet crews knew they'd been spotted. By the time Soviet subs crossed the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, their location was already being plotted inside U.S. Navy command centers in Norfolk and Pearl Harbor. Next came data fusion. In traditional navies, data sat in silos. Sonar operators knew one thing. Torpedo rooms knew another. And the bridge had to piece it together. Not so in the Los Angeles class. Every sensor was networked. Every threat classification, torpedo trajectory, and sonar contact was displayed on integrated digital screens, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary in the 1980s. Submarine commanders no longer fought through analog signals. They fought with a real-time battlefield in their minds, mapped by machines, refined by training, executed without delay. Finally came the kill chain. Came the kill. Los Angeles-class boats were not built to match the Soviets one-on-one. They were built to pick the time and place of every engagement. Using MK-48 aid-cap torpedoes, guided, wire-controlled, and capable of zigzagging through countermeasures, these subs could eliminate targets from over 30 nautical miles. But perhaps more dangerous than torpedoes were the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which could be fired from submerged positions and hit targets hundreds of miles inland. These weapons allowed submarines to shift from sea control to strategic strike platforms overnight. In the event of war, a single Los Angeles class could fire the first blow not just at a ship, but at a Soviet air base, radar site, or command bunker. Soviet doctrine never recovered from this shift. Their fleets had been built around forward presence and ballistic missile bastions, protected by layers of surface ships and attack subs. But the Los Angeles-class submarines nullified this approach. In war games, one U.S. sub could penetrate the bastion, destroy a missile boat, and escape before the Soviet Navy could respond. Entire strategies collapsed in simulation. And more alarmingly, Soviet planners realized that they wouldn't even know the sub was there until after the damage was done. This wasn't just a technological shift, it was a doctrinal inversion. The Soviets had built their navy around detection and area denial. The U.S. had built theirs around information dominance and precise lethality. The result, one side fought blind and slow. The other saw first, struck first, and never got hit. The Soviet command's nightmare wasn't just that the Los Angeles-class submarines existed. It was that they couldn't stop them, couldn't find them, and couldn't understand how the Americans had pulled it off. They didn't just lose sonar supremacy. They lost the ability to write the rules of undersea warfare. And in the Cold War, when perception was power, that was fatal. That was. In the spring of 1986, a routine Soviet naval exercise unfolded in the Barents Sea. 6 submarines, 4 destroyers, 2 guided missile cruisers, and the Northern Fleet's pride, its aircraft carrier Kiev, moved into position. The war game's objective was straightforward: simulate a coordinated anti-submarine warfare operation to intercept and destroy a Western fast-attack submarine breaching Soviet waters. What they didn't know was that one Los Angeles-class submarine, the USS Dallas, was already there. She had slipped in days earlier, undetected by the SOSUS lines, by the anti-submarine patrols, and by the acoustic sensors mounted on the seabed. Operating at periscope depth, she recorded every Soviet maneuver. Her sonar arrays logged engine harmonics, rudder cavitation, and formation changes. And then, with the push of a button, she began the exercise her way, without firing a shot, using only simulation torpedoes. The Dallas began killing Soviet vessels in silence. One by one, she tagged the tattletale trawlers assigned to monitor U.S. ships, then the destroyers, then the support submarines, and finally, she got a firing solution on the Kiev herself inside the carrier's presumed protective screen. Back at ComSubland headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, the U.S. Navy had the entire exercise mapped in real time. The Navy's fast attack doctrine had just gone from theory to proof. The Soviets were humiliated. Naval officers watching replay footage at their own command centers realized what had happened only after American briefings were leaked through NATO intermediaries. The Los Angeles class hadn't just survived their exercise, it had won it. Not in combat, but in silence. This wasn't the first time. Similar scenarios played out in the Mediterranean, the Norwegian Sea, and off the Kamchatka Peninsula. In one famous Pacific intercept, a Los Angeles-class boat penetrated a Soviet submarine bastion during ballistic missile training and simulated a kill on a Delta III SSBN before exiting undetected. That sub returned to Pearl Harbor without ever breaking radio silence. Each time, the message was the same: your bastions are vulnerable, your sonar grid is porous, and your ships are obsolete the moment they move. And each time, Soviet naval officers offered the same explanation: this must be a fluke. No American submarine could be that quiet, that fast, and that effective. But denial eroded with each encounter. Eventually, reality sunk in. When American admirals declassified snippets of their tactical logs for diplomatic leverage, Soviet counterparts were forced to acknowledge a horrifying truth: their entire Cold War naval strategy based on layered detection, swarm tactics, and sonar saturation had failed. The Los Angeles class had rewritten the battlefield geometry. Soviet naval doctrine emphasized three-dimensional coverage: sonar nets below, maritime patrol aircraft above, and destroyer pickets in between. But the American subs didn't operate like conventional warships. They weren't just targets or threats. They were predators, silent, informed, and perfectly lethal. For the Soviets, who prided themselves on numbers, firepower, and hardened steel, This was the ultimate insult, just one could theoretically neutralize an entire surface fleet before the opening phase of a war. This humiliation didn't remain inside command rooms. It leaked into policy papers, training rewrites, and naval budget debates. Entire ASW flotillas were restructured. Exercises were canceled. The prestige of the Soviet Navy, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of one undeniable fact. The Americans had made noise obsolete. In war, defeat isn't always a battlefield loss. Sometimes, it's the moment your enemy proves he can kill you before you even know he's there. The Soviet Navy had long believed that numerical advantage and firepower could offset any Western technological edge. For decades, this belief had anchored their war-fighting doctrine: throw more subs, more sonar buoys, more missile tubes at the enemy than he could ever handle. But in the aftermath of the silent humiliation inflicted by the Los Angeles class, that belief collapsed quietly but completely. Strategic planners at the main naval staff in Moscow faced a brutal reassessment. Their models, projections, and patrol doctrines had all assumed detectability. Detection meant response. But what if detection itself was no longer guaranteed? Suddenly, every bastion plan, those carefully coordinated SSBN sanctuaries surrounded by ASW forces, was suspect. The idea that strategic deterrence could be maintained by hiding missile submarines under a dome of noise and steel now felt like a dangerous illusion. If a single American sub could slip past that dome, the entire Soviet nuclear deterrent could be compromised before launch. This wasn't just a tactical failure. It was an ideological one. The Soviet military-industrial complex was built on visible power, huge fleets, immense bases, heavy armor. The American paradigm, by contrast, was becoming invisible stealth, precision, information dominance. The very things Soviet central planners had deprioritized or dismissed as capitalist illusions were now exposing the hollowness of their approach. The submarine service, the pride of the Soviet fleet, was shaken to its core. Career officers began requesting transfers. Younger conscripts, once eager to serve in elite undersea units, grew disillusioned. If the enemy could see everything you did and you could see nothing he did, what was the point? The KGB internal memos were even more blunt. One noted that the Americans have rendered our deep-sea deterrent vulnerable not by attacking it, but by rendering it obsolete. This strategic rupture didn't stay confined to the seas. It bled into land and air doctrine, too. Soviet high command began questioning the survivability of their entire Cold War force structure. Could their radars see what mattered? Could their missiles hit what moved? And most dangerously, could their people still believe in the system after this? By 1989, that question had metastasized. Because the silent American submarines weren't just defeating Soviet ships, they were defeating Soviet confidence. And when confidence dies in a command economy, collapse becomes inevitable. Today, the Arctic seas remain frigid, dark, and vast. But somewhere beneath them, the legacy of a single Los Angeles-class submarine still ripples through the sonar networks of a new era. The Soviet Union may have collapsed, but the lesson it learned in silence remains etched in every Russian naval doctrine: invisibility kills. The idea that a lone American sub could ghost its way through an entire fleet, track it without being tracked, and score virtual kills before anyone realized it was there was not just humiliating, it was revolutionary. That revolution still defines how underwater warfare is fought. Modern Russian submarines, like the Yasin class, are quieter than their predecessors. Their crews train with passive sonar and aggressive counter-detection drills. But even now, Russian admirals acknowledge the benchmark: the U.S. Navy's undersea dominance, born in the Cold War, continues today. American Los Angeles-class subs, some still in service, evolved into the Virginia-class, even quieter, more agile, more lethal. But the mission is unchanged: to be the ghost in the deep, the uninvited witness, the silent assassin. In a future conflict, they may not need to fire a shot. The knowledge of what they could do may be enough to shift an enemy's decision before it's ever made. Back in the Cold War, Soviet commanders called it asymmetric terror, the fear that your most powerful ships could be sunk by something you could not find. That terror has never left, and beneath every Russian war game, every missile drill, and every sonar ping today, there is still a whisper in the dark. A whisper of the time when a single U.S. submarine rewrote the rules of naval warfare without making a sound.